All right, hey guys, this is Coach Barryline in again on another snow day, but we're going to talk today about the Great Society, which is the presidency of Lyndon B. Johnson. Now, Johnson is often ignored. His accomplishments, his domestic policy accomplishments are often ignored. You know, he sits between Kennedy, who is kind of blown up to this kind of mythical figure, and Nixon, who really kind of wrecks respect for the presidency in general. So Johnson is often forgotten until that we're talking about the Vietnam War, and then everybody talks about what terrible choices he made in the war. But Johnson has maybe the most impactful domestic policy presidency of any president in American history, except for maybe probably Lincoln and maybe FDR. And really the Great Society is more like a second New Deal. And Great Society programs have a huge impact on our everyday lives today. And we'll talk about that as we get into it. So Johnson was a former senator, so he uses his skills to kind of push Kennedy's proposals, the New Frontier proposals, but expand them in what he calls the Great Society. So we're going to talk about Johnson's background and why they're preparing for being president, why he was more successful in getting Congress to go along with what he did, how the Great Society impacted the nation, and the foreign policy decisions that are obviously going to be important during Johnson's presidency. Johnson was a big guy. He's very intense, kind of in-your-face kind of guy. He was crude and crass a lot of times, so he wasn't like good-looking and charming like Kennedy was. But he was very hard-working. He probably got less sleep than about any other president in American history because he worked all the time. Very ambitious. I mean, he never made any bones about not wanting to be president. But he did have a genuine desire to help people. Johnson, his first career was as a teacher, and he taught underprivileged kids in Texas, and that really made him see a lot of the problems that the poor in America faced. So he was more concerned with the poor and the underprivileged than Kennedy was in many ways. And so he was a New Deal Democrat. You know, he made his bones in politics coming up during the Democratic control of the House of Representatives and the Senate during the New Deal, right? So that really shapes him as a politician. He really believes that government can have a positive impact on people's lives. So again, you know, he was a school teacher in Texas, the only president that was a school teacher, by the way. Served as a congressman for a short time until he was elected to the United States Senate. He was elected the majority leader in the Senate after only one term, and that's unheard of. Usually senators are there for 5, 6 terms a lot of times before they get to the point where they're the majority leader. But so he's basically running the Senate after his first term. So he's been there, 6 years, and he's the head of the whole shebang. So anyway, by 1960, Johnson really is the most influential Democrat in Washington. Of course, Kennedy is elected in 1960, and he actually defeats Johnson for the Democratic nomination and asks Johnson to run to help solidify his support in the South, or to help build support in the South. So Johnson was a very effective president because he understood the rules of the Senate, the legislative process. He had lots of friends in the Senate that owed him favors, and he basically vows after Kennedy's assassinated he's going to push forward Kennedy's reforms. So basically, he calls on members of the Congress to pass Kennedy's program. He makes a speech and says, if we don't pass these programs, such as the Civil Rights Act, then Kennedy will have died in vain. So, he pleads to the nation's emotions. However, Johnson wants to go past Kennedy's plans. He wants to not just ensure civil rights, but he wants to wage what he calls the war on poverty and eliminate poverty. He wants to pass tax cuts for the poor and the middle class, and of course civil rights legislation is a huge part of his his agenda. So Kennedy had been influenced by Michael Harrington's book, The Other American, and this was a study of poverty that that kind of showed how many Americans lived, even though there had been so much prosperity developed in the post-war. And Johnson understood it on a very personal level. He had taught kids who were very poor. So he launches, when he becomes the president, as soon as after passing the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and signing into law, he asked Congress to pass the Economic Opportunity Act, which is the first shot in what he'll call the war on poverty. And this funds all kinds of anti-poverty programs. Poverty programs, excuse me. And some of them are still with us today. For instance, the Job Corps offered work training for unemployed young people. VISTA is kind of like a domestic version of the Peace Corps, where you can volunteer to go out and serve your nation in the United States, helping other people or doing land management, things of that nature. You also had adult education programs, work programs for the unemployed, especially for parents. Also, rural poverty programs and things to assist migrant workers. So all of these are trying to reduce the impact of poverty. He also pushed for the passage of Kennedy's tax cuts. Congress wanted the president to hold government spending to $100 billion. But what Johnson does is he says, look, you're holding this bill hostage. So he uses the press to go straight to the American people, basically. He used that bully pulpit to go over Congress's head, and they pressured Congress to pass it. So it does pass, and the nation grew by 10%. I mean, it's a huge, massive amount of growth. I mean, when the country's doing really well, you're talking about a 5%, 5.5% growth, but 10% is unbelievable. So the economy expands almost immediately after this tax cut. He also pushed for the passage of Kennedy's Civil Rights Bill. Kennedy introduced it, but probably Kennedy would never have been able to get it passed. I mean, he was not a very experienced legislator. He just wasn't as good at it, really, as Johnson was. And Johnson was able to get support from both sides and convince Congress, the House and the Senate, to pass it. So in 1964, the Civil Rights Act is signed into law. Not even though Strom Thurmond, who was a strong Southern Democrat at the time, and may have by that time become a Republican, but he was a very powerful senator. He staged a one-man 24-hour filibuster in the Senate to try to prevent it, but it eventually passed and was signed into law by President Johnson. So the Great Society basically is his plan to improve the nation. And he had to first win re-election. Kennedy was assassinated in '63. He finishes the rest of Kennedy's term and then runs for re-election in '64. Hubert Humphrey is his vice presidential candidate, and he runs against Barry Goldwater, who was the Republican nominee. Goldwater had very different views from Johnson. He did not believe that the government had a role in people's lives. He believed that the government should do as little as possible. And he also didn't agree with the idea of limited war. And he advocated using nuclear weapons to end the war in Vietnam. So, he's kind of painted as a wild-eyed crazy guy in the campaign. And President Johnson says, stakes are too high. You need to keep the course and all that kind of stuff. And he wins really in a landslide, one of the largest victories in presidential history. All right, and we're going to talk about some of the specific proposals of the Great Society, and you guys should be able to spot a bunch of these that have a huge impact on your daily lives and your parents, grandparents, whatever. First, you have the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which was the first time in American history that the federal government put large amounts of money towards schools throughout the nation. So it was the first federal aid to schools, which is, really increases schools' abilities to educate their students. Then you had the Higher Education Act, which creates federal scholarships and grants and loan programs for students to go to college. The Pell Grant, for instance, was created by the Higher Education Act. Also, the Great Society created Head Start. He signed into law Head Start. It's a federally funded education program for children of low-income parents. A lot of you guys probably went to Head Start when you were younger, or preschool. The Omnibus Housing Act, which created Department of Housing and Urban Development, and you had the development of housing projects for the poor and rent subsidies and things of that nature. Of course, Medicare and Medicaid are probably the two that you guys know the most about, right? Medicaid for poor people, Medicare for people who are over the age of retirement. Also, there was a push for the environment to improve water and air quality. And his first lady, Lady Bird Johnson, works for the Highway Beautification Act, which sets standards for maintenance and makes it illegal to litter and that kind of thing. All right, so between 1965 and 1966, Johnson is able to push through a number of bills, and basically this is the bulk of the Great Society. But a lot of people become kind of nervous about the rapid pace of reform. So in '66, the midterm elections, Republicans gained more seats in both the House and the Senate, and this does slow down Johnson's legislative program. However, he still passed the Public Broadcasting Act, which creates PBS, right, like that where you see Sesame Street and things like that, and also National Public Radio. Also, they passed the Truth in Lending Act, which requires people giving loans to give information to the people receiving the loans so that they are getting a good deal. And also a law to establish nation's wild and scenic rivers program, for tourism and protection. All right, however, his presidency gets bogged down in foreign policy. We'll talk about more about Vietnam later, but by the end of 1966, there's over 380,000 soldiers in Vietnam, and the government is spending about $2.5 billion dollars a month on the war. So what happens is you have the age-old guns or butter debate. Either you fund the military expenditures or you fund the other domestic expenditures to help people. And what happens is, in the Great Society, a lot of these programs aren't fully funded because of the war effort. So that's a problem. And Johnson's also expanding U.S. influence in other places like Latin America. Basically, he forms the Johnson Doctrine. It says that, if there are revolutions in America or in Latin America, that the United States will intervene to stop it. So this basically makes us more active in fighting communism in our own hemisphere as well. At the same time, he's fighting the spread of communism, trying to improve relations with the Soviet Union, much like Kennedy and Khrushchev had. They do sign a ban on weaponizing space, basically, and also the U.S. and the Soviet Union will sign a treaty to protect each other's diplomats in the other country. However, you did have a dust-up with North Korea in the Pueblo incident when the North Koreans captured a U.S. Navy spy ship. Now, the United States said it was in international waters and called up soldiers, but the North Koreans released the crew and kept the ship, so they kind of avoided a major incident there. But of course, we're going to talk more about Johnson's policies in Vietnam a little bit down the road when we talk about the Vietnam War. But obviously, it's a time of great change, and President Johnson affects a range of policies and programs and laws that still greatly impact us today. And we'll talk about Johnson's role in the civil rights movement a little more at a later date. So we'll talk to you guys later, and next time you see us, we'll be talking about the civil rights movement. See ya.